Bighorn Basin, Wyoming, September 1903. The autumn air was sharp and clean, carrying the scent of sagebrush and the promise of a brutal winter. On a small draw overlooking the Graybull River, a man was engaged in an act so peculiar it had become a form of local entertainment. Stoian Caragea, the Aromanian sheepman, was not felling logs or quarrying stone. He was beating wet wool with smooth, dark river rocks. He had built a strange, circular frame of bent cane, 18 feet across, looking more like a basket maker's folly than a foundation. Beside it, heaps of shorn wool, the summer's clip from his own flock, were being systematically dampened and hammered on a flat stone slab. The rhythmic thud of basalt on fleece echoed in the dry air, a sound no one in Wyoming had ever heard before. "He's pounding his house together," said Silas Croft, a neighboring rancher, leaning against his wagon. He shook his head, a gesture of pity mixed with amusement. "A house of wool." Halford Wickham, the county brand inspector, rode up, his posture stiff with the authority of his office. He was a man who understood the physics of the Bighorn Basin in terms of frozen livestock and cracked axles. He watched Stoian lift a matted, dense panel of what looked like gray felt and offer it up to the cane lattice. "It's foolishness, Stoian," Wickham called out, his voice carrying the easy confidence of a man who had never been wrong about winter. "You can't build a wall from a sheep's back." Stoian paused, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of a calloused hand. "It is not wool," he said, his English quiet and precise. "It is felt." Wickham grunted, unimpressed by the distinction. He had already delivered his professional opinion to anyone who would listen down at the stockyard. "Mark my words," he'd said, "that wall will soak up every bit of sheep grease smoke from his stove. Any meat he hangs in those rafters will be sour and rancid by Easter. It's an unbreathing wall. It'll sweat and rot from the inside out." The other ranchers had nodded. It sounded like experience. It sounded like fact. To them, Stoian's round hut was the work of a man driven mad by loneliness or nostalgia for some forgotten old country. The mockery lasted through the autumn. The structure rose, panel by 9-inch thick panel of boiled, pounded felt, lapped over the lattice like giant shingles. The men called it the wool yurt, the felt igloo, the sheep grease sweat lodge. Stoian Caragea simply kept working, his basalt hammers rising and falling, a steady, patient rhythm against the rising tide of ridicule. What did this Aromanian Vlach pastor, this transhuman felter from the Pindus Mountains of Greece, understand about the physics of boiled felt density that the most experienced stockmen and builders in Wyoming had missed? This channel is dedicated to the lost wisdom of the frontier, to the forgotten innovators who solved impossible problems with the materials at hand. Their stories are not just history, they are lessons in physics, engineering, and human resilience. If you believe, as we do, that the past holds practical knowledge for the future, then subscribe to our channel and hit the like button. I promise you will learn how a simple, ancient technique created an insulating material that outperformed log, stone, and sod. Let us know in the comments, what's the most unconventional building material you've ever seen used? Stoian Caragea was not a carpenter. He was not a mason or a frontiersman trained in the tight-scribed saddle-notch construction of a proper log cabin. He was a pastor, a shepherd, from a line of shepherds who had moved their flocks between the summer mountains and winter lowlands of the Balkans for 1,000 years. His hands knew the language of wool in a way no American rancher could comprehend. They had worked with the tools of his trade, the long curing vats, the heavy wooden mallets, and the smooth, water-worn basalt stones used to pound fleece into a material as dense and unyielding as seasoned timber. He knew that raw fleece was a cloud, but boiled and beaten felt was armor. He and his wife, Elena, had brought their two children, Anna and Ion, to Wyoming seeking land and a future for their own flock. They had bought a small parcel in the Bighorn Basin, a place whose sweeping vistas and harsh winds felt both alien and strangely familiar. They had survived their first winter, but only just. They had built a standard homesteader's cabin, a single-walled structure of pine logs, chinked with mud and grass, and they had learned the true nature of Wyoming cold. That first winter, the cold was not just a temperature, it was a physical force that broke things. Stoian remembered the morning the brass eyelets on his work boots pulled clean out of the frozen leather as he tried to lace them. He remembered Elena crying out in surprise when the thick iron handle of the milk jug snapped at the rivet as she lifted it from the porch, the metal made as brittle as glass by the 30-degree Waffers air. The cold had a sound, too. The cast-iron dough hook of Elena's mixer, a treasured item brought all the way from the old country, didn't scrape the mixing bowl. It rang against it with a high, clear chime, like a struck bell. They burned wood constantly, a whole cordon of it in a month, yet the cold lived inside with them. It clung to the walls, radiated from the floor, and painted the nail heads in the roof planks with delicate, cruel flowers of frost. Stoian knew they would not survive a second winter like that. He would not risk his family on the flawed geometry of a log wall. The problem wasn't the wood. The problem was convention. The standard log cabin, the symbol of American frontier resilience, was a thermal catastrophe. Its design was born of abundance, an abundance of thick trees and endless firewood. In the Bighorn Basin, where timber was scarcer and the winters more severe, its weaknesses were fatal. The primary failure was thermal bridging. A solid log, no matter how thick, is a continuous piece of material. Heat flows through it. The cold on the outside surface is conducted directly to the inside surface. A 12-inch pine log has an R value of about 15, but that assumes perfect construction. In reality, every knot, every check, every imperfection was a highway for heat to escape. The real enemy, however, was air infiltration. The spaces between the logs were sealed with chinking, a mixture of mud, clay, moss, or whatever was available. As the green logs dried and shrank over the first few years, and as the house settled, tiny gaps would open. In a normal climate, these were drafts. In a Wyoming winter, they were daggers of cold. At 20 degrees, a 5 mph wind could force enough cold air through a hairline crack to nullify the heat from a pound of burning wood. The Croft family, in their handsome, well-built cabin, spent their winter chasing these gaps, stuffing them with rags and paper, fighting a losing war against the physics of convection. They burned through their woodpile at an alarming rate, yet their cabin was never truly warm. It was merely less cold in the 2-foot radius around the stove. Water froze in a bucket 10 feet from the fire. Their world had shrunk to the hearth, the rest of their home, a frozen, hostile territory. This was the conventional wisdom, the proven method, and it was failing them, just as it had failed Stoian. Stoian began his own construction in late summer. He ignored the timber stands, heading instead to the river for cane reeds and smooth, heavy stones. He built the circular lattice first, a skeleton that looked flimsy and absurd to the men accustomed to the reassuring heft of 16-inch logs. Halford Wickham rode by one afternoon and watched for a full 10 minutes before offering his advice. "A straight wall is stronger than a curved one, son. Every carpenter knows that. Wind'll push that thing over like a willow basket." Stoian nodded, not looking up from his work. "A circle has no corner for the wind to catch," he said simply, and continued lashing the cane together with rawhide strips. Next came the felt. This was the process that drew the most scorn. He constructed a shallow wooden basin, filled it with water heated over a fire, and submerged bats of raw, cleaned wool, Once saturated, he'd drag a heavy bat onto his stone slab and begin the pounding. With a rounded basalt hammer in each hand, he worked the wool, his arms and shoulders moving in a tireless, ancient rhythm. He wasn't just flattening it. He was shocking the microscopic scales on each wool fiber, causing them to lock together permanently. He'd fold the mat, dampen it again, and continue pounding. The process took hours for each 3 by 5 foot panel, transforming a fluffy 6-inch pile of fleece into a dense 9-inch thick plank of felt that was as stiff as a board and surprisingly heavy. All that work, and for what? Silas Croft asked him one day, genuinely perplexed. You could have 2 walls of my cabin up in the time it takes you to make one of those wool blankets. This is not a blanket, Stoian replied, running his hand over the dense, uniform surface of a finished panel. This is a wall. He fastened the panels to the outside of the cane lattice, overlapping them like immense shingles. He sealed the joints with a paste of lanolin and lime. Inside, he lined the entire structure with tanned sheepskins. The fleece turned inward, creating a soft, insulated surface. For the roof, he created a layered, conical structure of 5 progressively smaller felt panels, ensuring no seam was exposed to the sky. The final step was the outer skin. He mixed a thick render of lime, sand, and horsehair, and plastered the entire exterior, working the mixture into the fibrous surface of the felt. When it dried, it was a hard, seamless, off-white shell. The round, domed structure looked like a piece of the old world dropped into the Wyoming landscape. It had no sharp edges, no visible joints, just a smooth, curved surface. Wickham made his final inspection when it was done, walking around it slowly and shaking his head. He delivered his ultimate professional objection. I'll give you this, Stoian. It's tight. Too tight. A house has to breathe. All the moisture from your cooking and your breath is going to get trapped in that wool. It'll be a damp, stinking mess by January. And like I said, that smoke is going to ruin your meat. He was not being cruel. He was applying the lessons of his environment. He was also completely wrong. Stoian Caragea understood a principle of thermodynamics that his neighbors, for all their practical experience, had missed. The problem wasn't keeping cold out. It was keeping still air in. He hadn't built a wool house. He had built a house of trapped air. The genius was in the pounding. Raw, carded wool is an excellent insulator, familiar to anyone who's worn a wool sweater. Its insulating power comes from the air trapped between its chaotic fibers. However, this air is not truly still. It can move within the matrix of fibers, and over a large enough area, convection currents can form, reducing its effectiveness. Furthermore, it can hold moisture, which is a catastrophic conductor of heat. Stoian's boiled and pounded felt was a different material entirely. The violent, repetitive process of hammering the wet wool did more than just interlock the fibers. It created a dense, closed-cell structure. Under a microscope, a cross-section of his felt would look less like a tangle of threads and more like a honeycomb. He had created, by hand, a solid-state foam. His felt weighed 0.6 pounds per cubic foot and contained an estimated 3,200 closed microcells of air per square inch. This was the secret. The air inside each tiny cell was completely immobile. It could not circulate. It could not form a convection current. Heat could only transfer through this material by slow, painstaking conduction. A 9-inch panel of this material yielded an R value of approximately 30. For comparison, a 12-inch solid pine log offered at best an R15. Stoian's walls had double the insulating power of his neighbors' log cabins. Furthermore, Wickham's fears about moisture were unfounded. The extreme density of the felt made it highly resistant to moisture penetration, and the outer lime render was the final, brilliant touch. It was breathable on a molecular level, It would allow water vapor to pass slowly through, but it was completely impervious to wind. Air infiltration, the primary enemy of the log cabin, was reduced to zero. Stoian's round house didn't have to breathe through 1,000 tiny cracks. It was a sealed, high-performance envelope. The small stove inside wouldn't be fighting a constant invasion of cold air. It would only have to heat the volume of air already inside the structure and compensate for the slow, minimal heat loss through the R30 walls. Stoian had not built a primitive yurt. He had built a 1903 version of a modern passive house. That winter, the Bighorn Basin did not just get cold, it was assaulted by a specific and terrifying weather phenomenon. A lee-side downslope event settled in for 9 straight days. It wasn't a blizzard, which brought the insulation of snow. It was a relentless cycle of wind and plunging temperatures. A powerful Chinook wind, usually a harbinger of warmth, would roar down the eastern slopes of the Absaroka Range for hours, gusting to 50 miles per hour. But instead of warming the air, it scoured every last degree of heat from the landscape. Then, the wind would suddenly cease. In the dead, echoing silence, the temperature, already at a brutal 27 degrees, would plummet. Within 30 minutes, it would hit 44 degrees. The cycle would repeat every few hours, a screaming wind that froze fuel solid, followed by a silent, crystalline cold that shattered iron. For the settlers in their log cabins, it was a nightmare. The wind drove the cold through the chinking like pressurized water. Inside the Croft cabin, the family huddled around their stove, which glowed a dull red but seemed to cast no heat. Every surface away from the fire was covered in a thick layer of rime ice. The windows were opaque white sheets. When the wind stopped, the silence was worse. The house would groan and pop as the logs contracted in the sudden, deeper cold. They slept in their coats, packed together in one room, listening to the world crack around them. They were surviving, but they were not living. At the Caragea homestead, life went on. The roaring wind was a distant hum against the thick, silent felt walls. There were no drafts, not one. The air inside was still and calm. Elena kneaded bread on the kitchen table, and the dough rose steadily in its bowl, a small, miraculous act of biological warmth. The children, Anna and Ion, played on the sheepskin floor in their shirt sleeves. The small stove required feeding only a few times a day. It emitted a gentle, steady warmth that filled the entire circular space evenly. There were no cold spots, no icy corners. The temperature inside held at a constant 68 degrees Fahrenheit. Stoian kept a simple record. He had a thermometer inside and one outside. During the worst of the downslope event, when the air outside plunged to 44 degrees, the temperature inside his felt house dropped only 2 degrees, from 68 to 66. Over the 4 hours, the stove was left to die down to coals. The contrast was not just a number. It was the difference between life and a slow siege. While his neighbors were burning through their precious fuel just to stay alive, Stoian was comfortable. His innovation was not just working, it was defeating the worst winter the basin had seen in a decade. On the 7th day of the cold spell, Halford Wickham was making his rounds, a grim duty of checking brands on livestock that had frozen in the fields. It was a way of auditing the ruin. He was 2 miles from the Caragea draw when the cold found its next victim. With a sound like a pistol shot, a spoke on his wagon's rear wheel cracked, the old wood contracting beyond its limit. The wheel buckled, and the wagon lurched to a halt. He was stranded. The wind was rising again, and the sky was a hard, pale gray. He was a capable man, but he knew the odds. A man on foot in this weather was a poor bet. He saw the wisp of smoke from Stoian's chimney and began to walk. He expected to burst into a frigid, smoky, miserable hut. He expected the desperate cold he had felt in every other cabin he had visited that week. He stumbled through the door Stoian opened for him, bracing for the familiar misery. But the air that met him was not cold. It was not even hot and smoky like the area around an overworked stove. It was just warm. An even, silent, peaceful warmth that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. There was no draft from the door he'd just opened. Elena wordlessly ladled a bowl of hot, sour cabbage soup into his hands and sat him at the table. The children watched him, their faces placid, not pinched with cold. The warmth soaked into his frozen limbs. He devoured the soup, then a second bowl. It was the best thing he had ever tasted. It was only as he was finishing his second bowl that he noticed the silence. It wasn't just the lack of wind noise. It was the lack of a crackling, roaring fire. He turned his head and looked at the small parlor stove. It was dark. The metal was a dull, cool gray. There were no embers visible through the grate. He stared at it, the spoon halfway to his mouth. "Your stove," he said, his voice hoarse. "It's out." Stoian nodded from across the room where he was mending a harness. "Since this morning," he said, "it is enough heat for now." Wickham slowly put the spoon down. He stood up and walked to the wall. He placed his bare palm flat against the sheepskin lining. He expected to feel a deep, penetrating cold, the signature of a Wyoming wall in January. He felt nothing. It was neutral. It felt like the inside of his own coat. It was not radiating cold. It was not radiating anything. It was simply there, a barrier. Absolute. His eyes scanned the room, trying to reconcile his lifetime of experience with the evidence of his senses. He saw a small shelf near the wall. On it sat several jars. One contained a light yellow substance. He recognized it immediately. Beeswax candle blanks, melted down and stored for later use. At the Croft Ranch and at every other ranch, their emergency candles were contorted, frozen drips, the wax having solidified in waves as the ambient temperature fluctuated. Here, in Stoian's house, the surface of the wax in the jar was perfectly flat, smooth, and level, as if it had been poured in a warm room and left to cool undisturbed. It was pourable. It was proof. A small, mundane detail that testified to a miracle of physics. Wickham turned back to Stoian, the arrogance and certainty gone from his face, replaced by a profound and unsettling awe. He finally understood. The wool, the circle, the pounding. It wasn't madness. It was genius. "My God, Stoian," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "You didn't build a wall. You built a fleece that never forgot the river." The story of Halford Wickham's conversion spread faster than a prairie fire. When the brand inspector, a man whose opinion on the practical matters of survival was held as gospel, began telling people that the strange Romanian's felt hut was the warmest place in the Bighorn Basin, people listened. Wickham didn't just recant his old criticisms. He became an evangelist for the new method. He described the silent, even warmth, the cold stove, and the perfectly flat surface of the beeswax. He used his authority not to mock, but to teach. That spring, the Bighorn County Stock Growers Association, of which Wickham was a respected member, published its annual circular on winter shelter improvements. Tucked between articles on windbreaks and feed storage was a 2-page spread titled Instructions for the Pounding of Felt Panels for Insulated Structures by S. Caragea. It detailed the entire process, the selection of wool, the construction of the pounding slab, the method of boiling and beating, the recipe for the lime render. Stoian, who had never sought recognition, shared his knowledge freely. He answered every question, demonstrated the technique to anyone who made the journey to his draw, and never once mentioned the months of ridicule. The adoption was slow at first, then rapid. That autumn, 9 ranch families across the county, including Silas Croft, built their own boiled felt structures. Some were small emergency shelters built near their main cabins. Others were ambitious additions. They discovered that the technique was scalable, adaptable, and, most importantly, that it worked. The fuel savings alone were staggering, with families reporting they used less than a third of the wood they had burned in previous winters. The comfort was immeasurable. The innovation spread, a quiet revolution of warmth and efficiency born from ancient knowledge and frontier necessity. The principles Stoian Caragea demonstrated in 1903 were a century ahead of their time. His boiled felt panel was, in essence, a primitive structural insulated panel, or SIP. He had created a composite material that combined structural integrity with a super insulated core. His focus on eliminating air infiltration by creating a seamless, rendered outer shell is now a foundational concept in modern building science, known as the air tightness layer. While his neighbors were focused on thermal mass, the thickness of their logs, Stoian understood the superior power of thermal resistance and the elimination of convection. He achieved an R30 wall performance that would be considered excellent for standard construction even today, and he did it using nothing but the fleece from his own sheep, river stones, and lime. In the end, the story of Stoian Caragea is about more than just a warm house. It is a story about the nature of knowledge itself. The frontiersmen of the Bighorn Basin possessed a hard-won, practical wisdom, but it was bounded by their own experience. They saw wool as a covering, a garment. They could not see it as a building block. Stoian saw it differently because his knowledge came from a deeper, older tradition. He understood that a material could be fundamentally transformed. The long, rhythmic pounding with the wet basalt stones was not just an act of compression. It was an act of instruction. Each blow was a lesson, teaching the chaotic fibers to lock together, to hold their trapped air, to become something more than they were. He didn't just pack a wall with his summer's clip. He taught his own wool to remember every blow it took from the river stone, and in that memory, to build a fortress against the killing cold. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the past. If you found this story of ingenuity and vindication as compelling as we did, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more tales of forgotten history and the timeless principles of survival. We make these videos because we believe the smartest person in the room is often the one nobody is listening to. Until next time, stay curious. This video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictional, but the techniques and scientific principles are based on real historical practices. Anyone attempting to apply historical building methods for modern use should consult with qualified professionals and adhere to all current building codes, safety guidelines, and local regulations. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.